The rain lashed against the windows of the Viper's penthouse, but the woman inside didn't flinch. It had been 1 year since Sana was sold for a debt, and 3 days since her husband's blood was hosed off the Mapo Bridge. In the boardroom below, Elder Kang smirked, holding T-Jun's bloodied wedding ring like a trophy. "The girl is nothing now," he told the council. "Without T-Jun to hide behind, she's just a 20-year-old orphan with a fancy wardrobe. We'll toss her out by morning." The doors didn't just open. They hissed as the electronic locks were overridden. Sana entered, her footsteps echoing like a death march. She wasn't crying. She was wearing T-Jun's favorite charcoal blazer over her shoulders, her eyes cold enough to freeze the blood in Kang's veins. Behind her stood the shadows, the elite guards who knew that while T-Jun was the strength of the syndicate, Sana was its brain. "You think he's dead because you pushed a piece of metal into the river." Sana's voice was a low, lethal hum. She walked to the head of the table and sat in the Viper's chair, her fingers interlaced. "You captured a lion and forgot that he spent a year teaching his lioness how to hunt." She leaned forward, the black diamond on her hand glinting. "I've already frozen the offshore accounts, Kang. You have no money, no mercenaries, and no exit. You have 48 hours to tell me where my husband is, or I'll show you exactly why the Viper was the merciful one in this marriage." The orphan was gone. The queen had arrived to claim her king. The silence that followed Sana's threat was deafening. Elder Kang looked down at the bloodied wedding ring in his palm, then back at the woman sitting in the Viper's seat. Only a week ago, at the secret summit in Gangnam, he had mocked T-Jun for being distracted by his foreign wife. He had called her a warm tea girl. Now, looking into her eyes, he realized he had miscalculated the temperature of the entire room. "You're bluffing," Kang spat, though his fingers trembled as he reached for his phone to check his accounts. "Those codes are biometric. You don't have the clearance." "I don't need clearance for a house I helped build," Sana said, her voice dropping into that low, predatory register T-Jun had praised her for. "While you were busy planning a funeral for a man you haven't even killed yet, I was rewriting the ledger's firewall. T-Jun didn't just teach me the business, Kang. He gave me the keys because he knew your greed would eventually outweigh your common sense." As the council members frantically checked their devices, only to find their screens flashing a crimson "access denied," Sana's mind flickered back to the peak of their power just days before. She remembered T-Jun standing behind her in the dim light of their private study, his hand over hers as they navigated the syndicate's encrypted digital infrastructure. He had been teaching her the leverage, the dark art of knowing a man's price before he even realized he was for sale. "Focus, Sana," he had whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "The shadow of the throne isn't cast by the chair. It's cast by the person who knows where the bodies are buried. If I ever fall, don't look for me. Look for the money. The money will lead you to the traitors." Now, that shadow was her only sanctuary. Elder Kang slammed his phone onto the obsidian table. "You think the shadows will protect you once they realize you've locked away their paychecks. They are soldiers, not babysitters." Sana didn't blink. She didn't even look at the elite guards standing like statues behind her. "The shadows aren't paid in money anymore, Kang. They're paid in loyalty. And they know that if I disappear, the vault stays locked forever. They don't serve the Viper because he's a man. They serve him because he's an empire. And right now, I am the only empire left standing." She stood up, leaning over the table until she was inches from Kang's face. The black diamond on her hand caught the light, a dark spark in the gloom of the room. "You have 48 hours, she repeated, her voice like a sharpening blade. "Every hour that passes without my husband's location is an hour I spend deleting another one of your shell companies. By tomorrow night, you won't just be out of the syndicate. You'll be back in the gutters where T-Jun found you." The orphan girl they expected to crumble had vanished. In her place was the architect of their ruin. As Sana turned to leave the boardroom, the elite guards moved in perfect unison to clear her path. She had claimed the throne, but as the doors hissed shut behind her, the weight of the empty penthouse above her felt like a mountain. She had the power. Now she just had to find the man she had promised to light the match for. The countdown on Sana's tablet flickered, 47:12:04. Every second that ticked away felt like a drop of blood hitting the floor. To find him, she had to dissect the moment it all went wrong. She retreated to the surveillance hub of the estate, the glowing monitors reflecting the cold, mechanical precision in her eyes as she pulled up the footage from 72 hours ago. It had been a Tuesday, a day that felt deceptively normal. Jun had been in the back of his armored sedan, traveling to the Blue House for a meeting he believed would solidify his legitimacy. "I'll be back for dinner, Sana," he had said that morning, his hand lingering on the back of her neck. "Wear the gold silk, I want to celebrate." But the celebration was a trap designed by the old guard and their puppets in the government. The setup was a masterpiece of betrayal. At 2:14 p.m., the city's traffic grid was hijacked. The monitors now showed the footage. A massive police raid was suddenly triggered at the syndicate's primary headquarters, a distraction to pull Jun's elite security detail away from his convoy. While the shadows were occupied with flashbangs and legal warrants, Jun's car was funneled onto the Mapo Bridge. Then the kill shot. A news alert flashed across every screen in Seoul. Beloved Minister Park found assassinated in his home. Within seconds, evidence was leaked to the press. A video, expertly deep-faked, showing Jun's personal vehicle leaving the scene of the crime. The Viper hadn't just been hit, he had been framed for a crime that made him public enemy number 1. "They didn't just want him dead," Sana whispered to the empty room, her fingers tracing the screen where the convoy was suddenly boxed in by black SUVs on the bridge. "They wanted him erased." The footage turned chaotic. A garbage truck rammed the lead car, and Jun's sedan was forced toward the edge of the Han River. In the middle of the carnage, his phone had buzzed. Sana remembered the final call. "Sana, listen to me." His voice had been tight, strained over the sound of gunfire. "They've planted my DNA at the minister's house. If the police take me, the syndicate falls and they'll come for you next. I have to go dark. I have to become a ghost to kill the men who did this." Jun, no. "The black key, Sana. Use it. Do not trust the council. I am the Viper, but you are the brain. Save the Empire. I'll find my way back to you through the blood." The line had gone dead. On the monitors, the sedan spiraled toward the water, an explosion rocking the bridge. The world saw a tragic end. Sana, watching the frame-by-frame playback, saw something different. A side door opening a split second before impact, a shadow slipping into the smoke. He wasn't dead, but he was framed, hunted by the state, and betrayed by his own brothers. The setup was perfect, except for one detail. They thought that by forcing Jun to disappear, they would leave the syndicate leaderless. They forgot that the Viper had spent a year making sure his wife was the most dangerous ghost of all. Sana closed the laptop. The setup was clear now. Elder Kang had used the police to clear the board, thinking Sana would run. "You wanted him dark, Kang," Sana murmured, her eyes catching her own reflection, cold, sharp, and unrecognizable. "Wait until you see what I do in the shadows." The silence of the Lee estate was heavy, a suffocating velvet that seemed to press against the walls. Outside, the world was screaming. News tickers ran on a loop, displaying Jun's face alongside the word assassin and deceased. The syndicate, sensing a vacuum of power, had already begun to tear itself apart at the seams. Lower-level captains were seizing warehouses, and the stock market was hemorrhaging the Viper's legitimate holdings. Sana sat in the Grand Library, draped in a sheer black silk robe that pooled around her like ink. To any observer, she looked like a woman shattered by grief. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture slumped, and a half-empty glass of amber liquid sat on the table beside her. When the front doors of the estate were shoved open without a knock, she didn't move. Elder Kang entered the room with the swagger of a man who had already won. He wasn't alone. 6 armed men followed him, their boots heavy on the hand-woven rugs Jun had imported for Sana's comfort. "The mourning period is over, Sana," Kang said, his voice dripping with a faux paternal pity that made her skin crawl. He walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling gardens as if he already owned them. "The police are circling. This estate is a target now. As a courtesy to my late brother-in-arms, I've made arrangements for you." Sana looked up, her voice small and trembling. "Arrangements?" "A safe house, outside the city," Kang lied, turning to face her with a thin, predatory smile. "You're a fragile thing, child. Too young to handle the wolves at the door. We'll move the assets into a trust for safekeeping, and you can live out your days in peace, away from the blood and the noise." Sana gripped her glass, her knuckles turning white. She knew exactly what his safe house was, a windowless room where she would be kept until they squeezed every password and biometric code from her. It wasn't a sanctuary, it was a prison. I can't leave, she whispered, her lip quivering. T-June said to wait for him. Kang let out a sharp, mocking laugh. T-June is at the bottom of the Han River feeding the fish. He's not coming back to save his little bird. He stepped closer, leaning over her, his breath smelling of stale tea and malice. Sign the transfer papers, Sana. Don't make this difficult. You're an orphan again. Accept it. He signaled to one of his men, who dropped a stack of legal documents onto the table. Sana reached for the pen, her hand shaking. Kang watched her, his chest puffed out with triumph. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, a weak, foreign girl broken by the loss of her protector. He didn't notice the way her eyes darted to the hidden camera lens in the corner of the room, or the way her thumb surreptitiously pressed a small button beneath the table. She was playing the part of the fragile queen to perfection. T-June had taught her that the best way to catch a snake was to let it think you were the bait. I'll sign, she murmured, tears finally spilling over. Just, please don't hurt me. Of course not, Kang cooed, reaching out to pat her hand. As the ink dried on the first page, Sana caught her reflection in the darkened window. Beneath the mask of the sobbing widow, her eyes were cold, calculating, and absolutely lethal. Kang thought he was moving her to a prison, but she was merely clearing the board so she could begin the hunt. The heavy iron door of the safe house groaned shut, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoing like a gavel. Elder Kang's men stood guard outside, thinking they had successfully caged a frightened bird. Inside the dim, luxury apartment, a high-rise prison overlooking the Han River, Sana dropped the act. The trembling in her hands vanished, replaced by a steady, surgical calm. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the dark water below. Her mind retreated to the cold, early mornings of the past year, the private training sessions T-June had insisted upon, even when she had been too tired to stand. Sana, his voice echoed in her memory, low and demanding. The world sees me as a monster because I am direct, but the real monsters are the ones who smile while they sharpen their knives. If I ever go dark, do not look for me in the streets. Look for the lesson I taught you on the day you thought I was being the most cruel. She remembered it clearly now. It was the day he had forced her to spend 6 hours in the basement vault, memorizing the serial numbers of gold bars. She had cried, thinking he was punishing her, but he hadn't been counting gold. Sana walked to the far wall of the penthouse, where a massive, ornate mirror hung. She didn't look at her reflection. Instead, she traced the frame until she found a small, microscopic imperfection in the wood, a notch no larger than a grain of rice. She pressed it, and a hidden panel behind the glass slid open to reveal a biometric keypad. She didn't use her fingerprint. She remembered his instruction. Your body can be forced, Sana. Your eyes can be covered, but your mind is a vault. She hummed a specific, dissonant frequency, a sequence of notes T-June had whistled every night before bed. The keypad glowed green. The wall hissed open, revealing a small, stark room containing nothing but a single server and a physical ledger bound in black leather. Sana opened the book. It wasn't a record of money, it was a record of sins. T-June had kept a fail-safe, the true ledgers of the Elder's crimes. Here was the proof of Elder Kang's human trafficking roots, the receipts for the minister's assassination, and the bank accounts showing they had been paid by a rival Japanese syndicate to remove T-June. A small digital screen on the server flickered to life. A pre-recorded video of T-June began to play. He was sitting in his chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking directly into the camera with a dark, knowing smirk. If you are seeing this, Sana, it means they have taken the bait. His voice was a ghost's caress. I didn't go dark because I was trapped. I went dark because the rot in the council had to be brought to the surface. I needed to know who would strike at you the moment I was gone. Now you have the truth, and you have their throats in your hand. Don't just survive, my queen. Rule. Sana felt a chill of realization. T-June hadn't been framed. He had allowed the setup to happen to test the loyalty of his empire and to finalize her transformation. He was out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for her to move the pieces. She closed the ledger, the weight of the black leather feeling like a weapon. She wasn't a widow waiting to be rescued. She was the executioner T-June had spent a year building. You wanted a fragile queen, Kang. Sana whispered to the empty room, her eyes burning with a lethal, dark fire. "I'm going to show you what happens when you cage a viper." The emergency council meeting was a victory lap for Elder Kang. Held in the syndicate's ancestral boardroom, the air was thick with the smell of celebratory cigars and the sound of men dividing a dead man's spoils. At the head of the table, T-Jun's chair sat empty, a silent tombstone for a king they believed they had buried. "With the girls secured at the safe house and T-Jun's assets frozen," Kang announced, his voice booming with unearned authority, "we move to dissolve the marital trust by morning. The Viper's era is over. The council returns to..." The heavy mahogany doors didn't just open. They were blown off their hinges by a controlled thermal charge. Smoke swirled into the room, and out of the haze stepped Sana. She was no longer the mourning widow in silk. She wore a sharp, custom-tailored white suit, the color of death in the East, and her hair was pulled back into a lethal, tight braid. Behind her stood the Shadows, the elite guards who had been missing since the bridge. They weren't flanking her to arrest her. They were marching in her wake like a private army. The elders scrambled to their feet, chairs screeching against the marble. "How did you?" Kang stammered, his face paling as Sana walked to the head of the table. She didn't answer. She pulled the black leather ledger from Chapter 4 out of her bag and slammed it onto the table with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. She didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, leaning forward, her knuckles resting on the wood. "Sit down," she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the low, vibrating growl T-Jun used right before an execution. Kang tried to sneer. "You have no right to be here, girl. This is..." "This is a crime scene, Kang," Sana interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a razor. She opened the ledger to a marked page. "On July 14th, you authorized a payment of $6 million to a mercenary group in Osaka. The memo said land development. The reality was the Mapo bridge hit. Would you like me to read the offshore routing numbers, or should I just show the council the video of you meeting the Japanese hitmen at the docks?" The room went deathly silent. Sana began to pace around the table, exactly as T-Jun did during interrogations, slow, rhythmic, and suffocating. She stopped behind a younger councilman, placing a hand on his shoulder. He flinched as if she had touched him with a live wire. "You, Director Park, you thought you were clever hiding the minister's murder weapon in your summer home in Jeju," she whispered. "I have the GPS logs of your driver, and you, General Choi, I have the recordings of you promising to hand over our shipping routes to the Oda clan." She returned to the head of the table, looking at the terrified faces of the men who had once looked at her as a fragile bird. "You thought T-Jun was the monster," Sana said, her eyes flashing with a cold, dark brilliance. "But T-Jun was the one who kept me from looking into your files. He was your shield. Now you're staring at the sword." She pulled T-Jun's silver signet ring from her pocket and slid it onto her thumb. She sat in the Viper's chair, crossing her legs with slow, deliberate elegance. "As of this moment, I am the regent of the Lee Syndicate," she declared. "Every account is locked. Every guard in this building answers to me. If anyone leaves this room without my permission, the evidence in this book goes to the Blue House, and you can spend the rest of your lives in a cell beside the uncle I sent to the slums." She leaned back, the black diamond on her finger glinting. "Now, who wants to be the first to tell me where my husband is?" The boardroom was under Sana's thumb, but the air outside was still thick with the scent of a hunt. Sana sat in the quiet of T-Jun's private office, the glowing monitors of the Viper's Nest surveillance system flickering before her. She was the regent, but she was a regent without her king. Suddenly, her private phone, the one with the encrypted line only T-Jun knew, vibrated. No caller ID appeared. Instead, a single text message popped up. "The spices in Guro are burning." It was a code from their first weeks together, a reference to her uncle's fate and the smell of the factories. It meant, "I am bleeding, and the enemy is close." "Trace it," she whispered to Director Han, the head of the Shadows. "But do not send a team. I go alone." She found him in the basement of a derelict spice warehouse in the Guro district, the very place she had once feared her family would sell her into. T-Jun was leaning against a rusted pillar, his tailored shirt soaked in dark, dried blood. A jagged wound ran across his ribs, but his eyes, those glacial, predatory eyes, were as sharp as ever. When he saw her, a shadow of a smile touched his pale lips. "You took the seat," he rasped, his voice a broken melody of pain and pride. Sana didn't cry. She moved to him, her fingers quickly working to dress the wound with the tactical kit she'd brought. "You let them hit the car, T-June. You let them think they won." "I had to see who would kneel to you and who would try to break you," he whispered, his hand catching her wrist, pulling her close until their foreheads touched. "You're not the girl I bought anymore, Sana. You're the Viper now. But the elders won't surrender just because you have their ledgers. They're desperate. Desperate men burn the house down to hide the rot." T-June explained the reality. Elder Kang hadn't just betrayed the syndicate. He had signed a pact with the Japanese Oda clan to sell off Seoul's infrastructure in exchange for protection. If T-June emerged now, the Oda mercenaries would trigger a citywide purge to cover their tracks. "We need them all in one place," T-June said, his grip on her hand tightening. "The blood pact we made. You have to be the villain, Sana. You have to make them believe you've turned against me, threaten to sell the syndicate to their rivals, make them move their final assets to the docks to stop you." Sana looked at the man she loved, the man who had destroyed her enemies and built her into a queen. "If I play the villain, the world will hate me. The shadows might even turn." "Let them," T-June's voice was a low, lethal hum. "Let the world believe you are the most heartless creature in Seoul. It will draw Kang out of his hole. And while you are holding their attention at the docks, I will be the ghost that cuts their throats." He pulled a small, silver dagger from his boot and pressed the handle into her palm. It was the same dagger he had used to threaten her uncle. "This is our pact, Sana. Your words are the bait. My steel is the trap." Sana stood up, the weight of the dagger in her hand feeling like a final seal. She looked down at T-June, her face hardening into a mask of cold, unyielding authority. "I'll give them a villain," she promised. "I'll give them a reason to wish they had left me in the slums." As she walked out of the warehouse, leaving T-June in the shadows to heal, Sana felt the last of her hesitation die. To save the Viper, the queen would have to become the very monster the world accused her husband of being. Sana's villain arc was a masterpiece of cold calculation. Within 24 hours, she had leaked false intel to the council, suggesting she was in talks with the triads to liquidate the Lee Syndicate's holdings and flee the country with the billions in the Zurich reserves. To the elders, she was no longer a grieving widow. She was a traitorous mercenary burning their legacy for a paycheck. Elder Kang, pushed into a corner and smelling blood, played his final, desperate card. Sana returned to the penthouse to find her private study ransacked. On the central monitor, a live feed flickered to life. It showed Minhee, the young maid who had been Sana's only source of kindness during her first months of captivity, bound and gagged in a cold, industrial basement. Beside her stood Elder Kang, flanked by 3 men who didn't look like syndicate soldiers. They were lean, scarred, and wore the black hand-red insignias of the Oda clan, the Japanese rivals T-June had fought for years. "You played your hand well, Regent," Kang's voice crackled through the speakers, his eyes wild with the greed of a man who had sold his soul to a foreign power. "But you forgot that I know your heart. You pretend to be a Viper, but you still care for the little people. If you don't bring the physical titles and the biometric override to the Incheon shipyard by midnight, the girl dies. And then, my Japanese friends will ensure you follow her." Sana stared at the screen. A year ago, she would have collapsed. A year ago, she would have begged. But she remembered T-June's voice in the spice warehouse. Make them move their final assets to the docks. She didn't pick up the phone to call the police. She didn't call the council. Instead, she walked to the center of the grand hall, where the shadows stood at attention. "Director Han," she said, her voice a calm, lethal hum. The giant man stepped forward, bowing low. "Ma'am, Elder Kang has moved. Our scouts confirm 30 Oda mercenaries have landed at Pier 7. He thinks I'm coming alone to trade a life for a kingdom," Sana said, her fingers tracing the silver dagger T-June had given her. She looked at the line of elite guards, men who had once looked at her with suspicion, but now looked at her with a reverence usually reserved for deities. "Kang has brought a foreign army onto our soil. He has betrayed the Viper, and he has betrayed you. Tonight, we don't just rescue a girl, we purge the rot." "The council still thinks you are the villain, ma'am," Han reminded her. "They may mobilize against us." "Let them," Sana replied, a dark, beautiful smile touching her lips. By the time they realize I was the bait, there won't be a council left to vote. You answer to the throne, and currently, I am the only one sitting in it." Director Hand slammed his fist against his chest, a gesture of absolute loyalty. "The shadows are yours, my queen." Sana traded her silk for a tactical bodysuit, holstering the black matte handgun and the silver dagger. She wasn't going to the docks to surrender. She was going to oversee a massacre. As the convoy of black SUVs sped toward Incheon under the cover of a moonless night, Sana checked the timer on her wrist. The final betrayal had been cast. Kang had revealed his Japanese allies, and in doing so, he had handed Sana the evidence she needed to execute him without trial. "Check your weapons," Sana commanded over the comms. "Tonight, we show the Oda clan why Seoul belongs to the Viper." The Incheon shipyard was a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and skeletal cranes, illuminated only by the rhythmic, flickering pulse of a distant lighthouse. The air tasted of salt, diesel, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Sana walked alone into the center of Pier 7, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. In her left hand, she held the briefcase containing the physical titles to the Lee Syndicate's empire. In her right, she held nothing. Her hands were open, a mock gesture of surrender. Elder Kang stood 50 yards away, flanked by the Oda clan's high-ranking mercenaries. Min-hee was slumped at his feet, trembling but alive. "Drop the case, Sana," Kang shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of triumph and desperation. "And give us the biometric override. Do it now and the girl lives. Do it now and I might let you leave the country." Sana stopped. A cold, hollow wind whipped her hair across her face. "You brought the Oda clan into our house, Kang. You traded our brothers for Japanese gold. Did you really think T-Jun's shadows would let you walk away with his crown?" "T-Jun is a ghost," Kang screamed, gesturing to the silent, dark containers surrounding them. "And you are a widow who overplayed her hand. Oda, take the case." As two mercenaries stepped forward, a low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the concrete pier. It wasn't the sea. It was the sound of the shadows moving in perfect, terrifying unison. Suddenly, the shipyard's floodlights roared to life, blinding the traders. From the top of a shipping container, a single, suppressed gunshot rang out, taking down the mercenary closest to Min-hee. Then, the darkness erupted. The shadows descended like a nightmare. But amidst the chaos of gunfire and clashing steel, a single figure emerged from the pitch-black shadows of a warehouse behind Sana. He didn't run. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a god of ruin. It was T-Jun. He was dressed in a tattered black suit, his shirt stained with the blood of the men he'd already carved through to get here. He didn't look at Kang. He didn't look at the mercenaries. His eyes were locked on Sana with a singular, terrifying focus. "T-Jun," Kang shrieked, stumbling back, his gun shaking in his hand. "Kill him, kill them both." T-Jun ignored the bullets whizzing past him. He reached Sana, and in a move that silenced the inner circle of the battlefield, the cruel Viper dropped to one knee before his wife. He didn't bow in submission. He knelt to inspect her. His large, scarred hands reached up, cupping her face with a tenderness that was more shocking than his violence. He checked her neck for bruises, her wrists for marks, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones as if verifying she was real. "Did they touch you?" he rasped, his voice a low, lethal hum that vibrated in her soul. "No," Sana whispered, her hand resting on his shoulder. "I handled them, T-Jun, just like you taught me." T-Jun stood up, his eyes finally shifting to Elder Kang. The tenderness vanished, replaced by a cold, abyssal rage that seemed to swallow the light on the pier. He didn't say a word. He simply drew a long, curved blade from a sheath at his back, the Viper's fangs. "Kang," T-Jun said, the name sounding like a death knell. "You touched what was mine. You threatened the only thing that makes me human." What followed was not a fight. It was a slaughter. T-Jun moved through the remaining Oda mercenaries like a whirlwind of black silk and steel. He was a man possessed, a king reclaiming a throne that had been insulted. Kang tried to flee, but he didn't get far. A silver dagger, the one Sana had been holding, thudded into the wooden crate inches from his head, thrown with surgical precision by the queen herself. "Leave him for me," Sana commanded, her voice ringing out over the dying groans of the traitors. T-Jun stopped, his blade hovering at Kang's throat. He looked back at Santa, a dark smirk tugging at his lips. He stepped aside, yielding the kill to the woman who had held his empire together while he was a ghost. The king had returned, but he wasn't there to rule alone. He was there to watch his queen finish the job. The sunrise over Seoul was not a gentle one. It broke through the clouds in jagged streaks of crimson and gold, illuminating the wreckage of the old world. By the time the city's elite woke up to their morning coffee, the old guard had ceased to exist. The purge was silent and absolute. Under the combined leadership of the Viper and his regent, the shadows moved through the city with surgical efficiency. Every elder who had sat at that mahogany table and whispered of betrayal was gone, not just removed from power, but erased from the ledgers of history. Their assets were absorbed, their loyalists liquidated, and their names forbidden within the walls of the syndicate. The Obsidian estate was left behind, a relic of a time when Santa was a guest and Taejun was a solitary monster. Their new headquarters sat atop a shimmering glass spire in the heart of Gangnam, a fortress of transparency and steel that looked down on the blue house itself. Santa stood on the edge of the wraparound balcony, 30 stories above the waking world. She wore a gown of liquid obsidian, the wind whipping the fabric around her legs like smoke. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had once trembled while scrubbing floors for her uncle. Now they were steady, stained only by the metaphorical ink of an empire. The glass doors slid open behind her. Taejun stepped out, his presence no longer a weight that crushed her, but a pillar that supported her. He was healed, though a new scar traced the line of his jaw, a permanent map of the price he had paid to see her rise. He held a small, heavy box made of dark velvet. "The council chambers are ready," Taejun said, his voice a low, melodic hum. "The new captains are waiting. They don't want to hear from the Viper today. They want to hear from the woman who broke the Oda clan without firing a single bullet." Santa turned to face him. "They're afraid, Taejun. They're waiting for us to turn on each other." "Let them wait for an eternity," he replied. He opened the box. Inside was not a tiara or a dainty piece of jewelry, but a circlet of black gold, set with raw, unpolished diamonds that looked like shards of frozen night. It was heavy, ancient, and absolute. Taejun stepped into her space, his hands steady as he lifted the crown. He didn't place it on her head while she knelt. He waited until she met his gaze, eye to eye, equal to equal. As he slid the weight of the new order onto her brow, he leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "I protected you until you learned to walk, Santa," he whispered, his voice thick with a dark, eternal devotion. "I built a cage to keep you safe, only to find that you were the one meant to hold the key. Now we run the world together." Santa reached up, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the crown before resting on Taejun's chest. She could feel his heart beating, a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched her own. The orphan girl who had been sold for a debt was dead. The fragile queen was a myth. She turned back to the horizon, Taejun's arms sliding around her waist, anchoring her. Below them, the city began to roar to life, millions of people unaware that their fates were now being guided by the two shadows at the top of the world. "They're looking up, Taejun," Santa murmured, her eyes reflecting the rising sun. "Let them," he replied, his grip tightening. "Let them see what happens when the Viper finally finds his match." The era of the old guard was over. The reign of the Black Diamond and the Viper had only just begun.